Well, we're on our way down to St Paul's Cathedral for morning service on Christmas Day. There's no better way, no better place to be other than the Vatican if you want to celebrate the birth of Christ. That doesn't mean that I'm actually celebrating the birth of Christ. It's all about tradition. But St Paul's Cathedral is one of the most iconic buildings in the United Kingdom. It's only been there for a couple of hundred years because it got burnt down during the Fire of London in 1666, and it was rebuilt by the architect Christopher Wren. Yeah, who we were talking about the other day when he visited Stonehenge. He was so impressed by it that he reflected the dimensions and the structure of Stonehenge into the dome at the top, which I can see on the other side of me now. Oh no, that's the Old Bailey. And St Paul's, it's an Anglican church. It's a seat of the Bishop of London. And I think this is going to be a pretty impressive service in a pretty impressive building. Excited? Woo! So we've just been to St Paul's Cathedral for morning communion at 8 a.m. on Christmas Day, and it was absolutely fantastic. That building is just something else. That's remarkable. It was rebuilt in after the 1666 Great Fire of London that burned it to the ground, and it burnt a lot of the books that were hidden, that were underneath down in the crypt in St Paul's Cathedral, the original cathedral, and then it was rebuilt by Christopher Wren. But we've come somewhere else that's absolutely fascinating if you're interested in criminal history, which a lot of us are. And if you've ever heard of the Newgate prison, it was for 4.5 centuries, it was the most horrendous place in the United Kingdom to be locked up. It gave birth to such expressions like the black dog of Newgate prison was coming to get you, because it was very depressing and very foreboding place. And it had some great historical figures were locked up there. Handsome Jack Sheppard, a young man who kept breaking out of Newgate prison, kept heading down to the East End and hanging out in London. He was found in Drury Lane drinking the day that he broke out of Newgate, the last time he managed to break out of there, and then he was taken to the Tyburn Tree and executed. Anyway, the Newgate prison got pulled down in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, and in 1902 they built the Old Bailey, and I think we've all heard of the Old Bailey. It's the criminal court, the main criminal court in London. It's the highest court in the land, and they've had some of the greatest trials in history there. Dr. Crippen in 1910, Oscar Wilde, Peter Sutcliffe, the Cray twins, the list goes on. Unfortunately, we were unable. I tried my best to get a tour of courtroom 1 of the Old Bailey, and we were unable to get it. So where the Newgate prison used to be, Newgate being one of the gates from the old Londinium, got pulled down, became the Old Bailey prison. Bailey comes from the term of the courtyard that surrounds a keep in a castle. So all these terms have a great etymology. This is the Old Bailey. What a building with an amazing history. Now, preceding the Newgate prison, people used to be executed at the Tower of London. When the Newgate came along, people like, Charles Dickens used to go there for inspiration. He couldn't just Google or YouTube, so he used to go to the orphanages in London, and he used to go to the Newgate and use it as inspiration to write some of his stories. And strangely enough, he had 9 children. 2 of them emigrated to Australia. His eldest one, Henry Fielding Dickens, became a lawyer and a judge at the Old Bailey. He was a successful man himself, so he would come here to the Old Bailey and try cases, and his father had come here a generation earlier when it was the Newgate prison. When you were sentenced to death, you would be taken from the Newgate down the Tyburn Road to the Tyburn Tree. Now the Tyburn Road is now Oxford Street, and it was like an hour's walk, but the executed person, the condemned person, on their way down there, the crowd would swell. And the hangings were usually on a Monday morning at about 8 a.m. And the crowd would swell, larger and larger. You'd end up with several thousand people walking from the Old Bailey or the Newgate all the way down to the Tyburn Tree. So this 1 hour walk would blow out to like a 3 hour walk, and the condemned individual, he had the opportunity to stop for a free beer at 2 different pubs on that path, on that route. The crowd would wait out the front while the condemned person went in there and had a beer. By the time they arrived at the Tyburn tree, which wasn't a tree, it was a triangular scaffold. Back in these days, when you would go to a hanging, you'd get drunk. It was a form of entertainment. You had a big day, like a day at the football. You go out, you'd have too much to drink. The next day you'd have a hangover. In the Old English, the day after was the day over. Hence the term hangover. Being drunk the next day, you don't feel too good. That's where we get that expression from. We also get the expression on the wagon from this period, because the only person who wasn't allowed to drink, even the executioner could drink. The only person who wasn't allowed to drink was the individual who was driving the carriage, the wagon. So, hence, he was on the wagon, not drinking. And there is one more expression which I struggle to understand myself. The old expression of pulling my leg. You've got to be pulling my leg. When your friends and family members were being hung, the most humane thing you could do was to jump on and pull their legs so hard that you would snap their neck. Because before we refined hanging through individuals like Marwood in the late 1800s, when the individual got hung, it would quite often decapitate them, or they would hang and asphyxiate. When Marwood came along, he was a butcher, he refined the art by hanging pigs based on the weight and the depth in which they would be dropped. He refined it, and he also twisted the noose on an angle so that it would snap your neck and you would die instantly, rather than hanging for up to 15 minutes asphyxiating or being completely decapitated, which was traumatic to see. Let me just clear my throat by saying that I don't support capital punishment. I don't think we should be taking lives. But having said that, if you've had a family member abducted, tortured and murdered and you want to support capital punishment, I'm more than happy to listen to your argument, because that's never happened to me. So it's a bit of a cop-out for me to say that I don't support it, because far too often we get it wrong. The last person to be executed in the United Kingdom was Ruth Ellis. She was the last woman to be executed on the... Anyway, it was proven that she was guilty of murdering her husband along with some...
Boyfriend.
Sorry?
Boyfriend.
I do stand corrected. One of the last young men to be hung in the United Kingdom was Derek Bentley. He was a 19-year-old lad who was convicted for inciting the murder of a police officer. There's conjecture, because he'd been involved in a building collapse previously during the bombing of Britain. He suffered brain damage, so he had the intellectual capacity of a child, and he called out to an individual who he was committing a minor offence with to let a police officer have it. This got misconstrued as asking his accomplice Christopher to shoot the police officer, and he was convicted for it. There is a movie called Let Him Have It, and the performance by the actor who played Derek Bentley was just something else. It's worth watching. Anyway, he was hung at Wandsworth Prison. Wandsworth Prison is probably about 30 kilometres south of where we are, and Wandsworth had some notable people. Derek Bentley, there was also George Chapman, who was one of the lead suspects in the Jack the Ripper case. He was hung there in 1903, and the individual who performed the execution, 2 of his family members had been executed as well, to find irony. Anyway, we're about to leave the Old Bailey, which used to be the Newgate prison, and we're going to do the walk down the old Tyburn Road all the way to the Tyburn tree, which is about an hour's walk, and we'll stop and dribble about English criminal history along the way. Postscript, just before we leave this point, the Viaduct Tavern over the road here is where a lot of the lawyers and judges and magistrates used to visit for a drink after work at the Old Bailey, and even the Newgate. And underneath, down in the cellars, I've been in there before, you can see the old cells that they used to have that apparently have tunnels leading across up into the Old Bailey. As we walk down to the Tyburn tree, one more story about capital punishment in the United Kingdom. The last woman to be burnt at the stake was Catherine Hayes in 1726, and she was burnt for the crime of high treason. And what that actually meant, high treason, was actually murder. She had murdered her husband. Well, she conspired to have him murdered and thrown into a river over near Vauxhall. And the last man to be burnt at the stake in the UK was Edward Whiteman. He was executed in 1712 for the crime of heresy. He didn't believe in God and he got caught, so they burnt him. Still on our walk down the old Tyburn Road to the Tyburn Tree, predating the Newgate, when we're talking about the medieval period, executions used to happen at the London Tower, out on Tower Green, but they also used to happen at Smithfield. And Smithfield used to be called Smoothfield. It's only a couple of minutes walk away from the Tower of London. And they now have the Smithfield markets there. But back when it had just become Smithfield in the 14th century, in 1381, the Peasants' Revolt kicked up down in the southeast, starting in Maidstone, and it was led by an individual named Wat Tyler. And Wat Tyler and his crew came up to London and they demanded an audience with the king. It was King Richard II. He was only 14 years old, and he was bunkered down in the tower because he was worried that this swelling crowd were going to become violent. And eventually he did a very brave thing. He jumped on a horse at 14 years old and he rode out to Smithfield, and he met with the individuals that led the Peasants' Revolt, and he made it clear to them, I am your king. Put down this revolt and go home. I'll take care of these matters. Unfortunately, Wat Tyler had lunged at the Mayor of London and he was killed at Smithfield as a result. Many famous people were killed at Smithfield, including William Wallace. He was killed at Smithfield and then he was drawn and quartered, and his head was stuck on a pike on London Bridge. It was not stuck on the Tower of London, contrary to what you read. St Paul's off in the distance. Just before we go to St Bride's Church and talk about the interesting story behind it, this pub here, the Old Bell, was purposely built for the workers who were working on the St Bride's Church, which is behind it. And the St Bride's Church is the inspiration for the layered wedding cake came from the church. You'll see why shortly. So this is St Bride's Church on St Bride's Lane, and I'll put up a photo in a moment so it tells a clearer story, but that was the inspiration of the wedding cake where it was layered. So the St Bride's Church is believed to be the oldest church in England, dating back to the 6th century, which this is what we're led to believe, although St Martin's in Canterbury I thought was older. Okay, we've come across the Royal Courts of Justice. This building reminds me very much of French architecture because you've got the points at the top and the sections that jut out. It's not consistent with English architecture, but it certainly is amazing. And we just had a conversation about the most beautiful cities we've been to, and I think Paris was. Architecturally just magnificent. Yeah, still on our walk from the old Newgate to the Tyburn Tree when stumbled across the South Australian flag, of all things. Oh, it's on the corner of Melbourne Place. So we're walking along Drury Lane now, which is on the way to the Tyburn Tree, and Drury Lane is where the Muffin Man used to sell his muffins from the fairy tale. And it was Drury Lane, in a hotel on Drury Lane, that Handsome Jack Shepherd got caught after he'd broken out of the out of the Newgate, caught drinking here. In fact, he hired a chariot at one stage. He hired a cart, horse and cart, and he rode it straight past the Newgate prison with a couple of girls in it. And he was boasting to them about how he'd broken out earlier that day. The man just couldn't be stopped. He was executed at 23 years old. He was just a kid, but he was unstoppable. He just kept, every time he'd break out, he could have disappeared into the countryside, but he never left London. He never left this immediate area. And another interesting thing about this street, and was the first pub I came to when I arrived up in London, just happened to be this one, the White Hart, which has had the same liquor licence since 1215. Non-stop liquor licence since the year that the Magna Carta was signed. Well, we're about to arrive at the St Giles Roundhouse and the bells are going nuts, so I had to record it. It's just up here around the corner. Well, this is St Giles in the Field. This is halfway from Newgate to the Tyburn Tree. And this actually used to be, well, it was Princess Matilda, Henry I's wife, who built this, or commissioned it to be built as a lepers hospital. But then in the 16th century it became the church. So the condemned individuals would reach this point here, they knew they were halfway to their execution.
Check this out. He's in there ringing the bell.
So we walked all the way down Oxford Street. We did the old route, the old Tyburn route. And there is Marble Arch, which used to stand out in front of Buckingham Palace. But was it Queen Victoria who didn't like it? Had it pulled down and moved over here? I think it was Queen Victoria. Yeah, she didn't like it. But we're just about to reach our destination, which is where the Tyburn Tree used to be. Tree, obviously meaning scaffold. And interestingly, when they hung people on the scaffold, they didn't always just hang them. They quite often stood them there and had a horse bolt, which would lift them up with a... It was pretty brutal. So this is Hyde Park over here. There's Marble Arch that we just came past. And right in the middle of Hyde Park is Speaker's Corner. The origin of Speaker's Corner was that the condemned individual was allowed to say anything they wanted just before they were executed, which is probably a very polite thing to do. Now, Mum, you're aware of all these things that we talk about, but because I'm in charge of navigation, sometimes you don't realise where we are until I stop and go, okay, you remember that? Well, that's where we are. So, come with me.
Hey, I do know where I am.
This plaque here is the exact location that the Tyburn Tree stood at, and this is where so many people were executed, led from the Newgate prison all the way down here and hung on the scaffold. This is the building on Park Lane that Benjamin Disraeli used to live in. He was the British Prime Minister under Queen Victoria. He said a couple of notable things that will probably echo through English history, or British history I should say. And one of those was he pushed for the purchase of the Suez Canal to make a passage to India much easier and quicker. He also made Queen Victoria the Empress of India. And he said after the purchase, it is settled. It's yours, ma'am. When you're limited to a couple of days in London, you can't stop to physically look at everything. So jump onto a bus. This monument is the Charing Cross statue. And it's a monument to Eleanor, King Edward I's wife. And this marks the official centre of London. And it was a memorial that was built to honour Eleanor because she was carried back for 12 days after she died. And this is one of the places they stopped at.